Who could have ever imagined that the last stop on our way to the Nintendo Switch 2 would be a remaster we've been pleading for ever since the Switch 1 came out? A return that was 8 whole years in the making, none other than Xenoblade X Definitive Edition. Not me. I couldn't imagine. I was a doubter. I didn't think it'd be possible yet, let alone on the scale it's taken now. This is one of the most ambitious open world games made even bigger. It is as much of an anomaly today as it was a decade ago. But of course, you may have heard by now that it didn't quite get its proper recognition back then. Not just because it was stuck on a whole different console, let alone a failing one, but because of how distinct it really was. X was somewhat polarizing among critics and fans alike, the latter mainly due to the expectations from Xenoblade 1. Nowadays, the community maintains that it boiled down to the lesser emphasis on story, and while that isn't the most accurate portrayal, it is a good place to start. When Earth falls victim to an alien war, humanity is left to survive on an unknown planet called Mira. And as gargantuan as its monsters are, the player avatar will soon find that they are nowhere near the biggest mystery of Mira. But hold your horses, Rook. Xenoblade X is a gameplay-driven experience. The main quest can't even be activated without frequent prerequisites. I had to spend 2 to 4 hours between most of the main quests. That is definitely too grindy for my liking. The conditions have been made slightly less demanding, but they still come off as overly protective. Because aside from the rare twist, the story is rather dull, and while I do like Elma, Lynn, and a couple of other party members, the cast as a whole is largely forgettable. They are a far cry from the highly acclaimed heroes of Xenoblade 3, but the bar has been raised thanks to a few additional characters. Liesel in particular has an exemplary storyline. Its jump in quality underscores how shallow most of the plot and party members are. It says a lot that the most memorable character besides Elma is Tatsu, all because of a terrible running gag about eating him. They don't just beat a dead horse or Napon, they exorcise its spirit. And it's a shame because there are a ton of genuine laughs when it comes to the side quests, but even the funniest joke would fall flat when repeated this frequently. The thing is, I do kind of like Tatsu, but if he was erased from existence, this would be a better game if only because there wouldn't be as much wasted dialogue. He is emblematic of how trivial the writing in X can be, and I don't mean compared to the other Xenoblade games, I mean in general. And that's not even the worst of it. The most egregious part by far is the onboarding process. X kicks off with an abundance of cutscenes, especially when compared to modern open worlds. I'd go as far as to say that the first 4 hours are bad. For a game that supposedly isn't about the story, the sheer amount of exposition is alarming. Even the characters acknowledge how drawn out it is, which honestly makes it more frustrating. If the developers knew it was bad, why didn't they come up with anything else? This is my least favorite cutscene in the whole damn game. The worst part about it is that afterwards, you know, you pick whatever you want, right? But it's just a menu that basically sums up this whole cutscene. But it's like 10 minutes just to be summarized in a simple menu.
Alright, you ready to choose?
I'm ready to choose, Elma. I've been ready since the hesitate. Oh my god! Hold on. Out of morbid curiosity.
Oh, for the love of...
No!
Once more from the top.
No!
Pretty much everyone.
Oh my god!
In one of several different fields. I can't stress enough how important this is. with me?
He's still with... Look, Elma, you know what I'm saying? It's been like 3.5 hours. We've been talking a lot, you know? I'm trying. I know I might seem overly critical right now. What happened to being gameplay driven? Why does the pacing of the story even matter? Well, that's because it gatekeeps numerous important mechanics, like say, the giant mechs this game is known for. The campaign is ultimately a means to an end. The real strength of the narrative was always in its side quests. That is where the enthralling personality of Mira truly gets to shine. There are so many memorable storylines that are not afraid to be weird, dark, and punishing. Xenoblade may be often compared to MMOs, but X resembles a Western RPG with how consequential its side quests are to the fate of its NPCs. New LA is a landmine of engrossing themes about how living beings will exploit each other even when, or perhaps especially when, they need each other to survive. Seriously, if it wasn't obvious by now, do not play this game if you don't like doing side quests. You are setting yourself up for disappointment. Although, I do understand the temptation, as thanks to Definitive Edition, there is also a juicy new epilogue to look forward to. I'll be diving into spoilers at the end of this video, but until then, rest assured, it does a terrific job at putting a bow on everything. I still wish we didn't have to clock in over 50 hours to get there, but the new story content is so compelling that it's even worth putting up with the main campaign. A word of warning though, do not start the new third act without at least a level 50 Skell. Trust me, you'll thank me later. Believe it or not though, the Skells are not the main event. They may be iconic, but what makes Xenoblade X so satisfying to play is the on-foot movement. To this day, it is rare for an open world to allow the player to traverse with this much mobility without any semblance of fall damage. Who needs a climbing mechanic when we can jump high enough to scale up mountains? The probes and field actions aren't the most unique objectives, but they prove that sometimes the simpler the better. They are so enticing to track down that any risk of a super boss is going to be worth taking. And with our agility, it's easy to get suckered into that addictive loop of just one more probe. It's not that far away, let me just get one more and then I can do what I actually came here to do. But then again, you could argue that they weren't even necessary. Mira is home to 5 gigantic continents that are leading the pack when it comes to engaging world design. There is a reason why Monolith Soft was hired for Modern Zelda, and you are looking right at it. In fact, one of my favorite changes in Definitive Edition is how much more saturated the game is. The colors delightfully pop in an area like Noctilum. But out of all the offerings in Mira, the pinnacle has to be Sylvalum. This is, at minimum, a top 5 Xenoblade setting. Its wondrous beauty never fails to be entrancing. Sadly, it's not all fun and games here. There is an excessive amount of loot, which you'll be constantly reminded of after every single battle. Similarly, due to the lack of Wii U gamepad, the map has to be opened after every single probe. And by virtue of incorporating a profusion of mechanics, way more than the already complex mainline entries, trying to keep up with all of them feels like doing chores. Mira deserves to be as seamless as possible, but instead, you do end up having to come back down to earth. So here's my advice. I say this about every Xenoblade game, but it is most relevant to X. You are going to be overwhelmed by how many terms and mechanics are being thrown at you. And that's okay. Do not stress about understanding everything, because everything will come with time. The most brilliant aspect of X's game design is how all of its mechanics feed into each other. As long as you're doing something, you are being productive. There is never a wasted moment. So don't feel pressured to be meticulous about your gear or frontier nav or whatever. Instead, feel free to explore to your heart's content, because somewhere along the way, that overwhelming mechanic is suddenly going to click. And no system in this game demonstrates that more than its battle system. The build potential for your avatar is massive, which I guess makes up for the bare bones character creator. They did add some throwback hairstyles and memes. No, I did not intend to resemble the Dark Mithra skin in Smash Bros, but she is indeed a cutie and I love her. Anyway, the combat should be familiar to any Xenoblade fan. Each party member has a loadout of arts that inflict various effects before having to cool down. There are many nuances in that alone, the most important being soul voices. The party will command each other to use a particular color of art, and if the player follows through in time, they will be granted healing or a certain type of buff. While I did get tired of the slow-mo it causes, I do like the additional strategy. It makes you think twice about when to use arts. Or at least, it did on Wii U. The Switch has opted for a quick recast feature that allows you to use an art without waiting for its cooldown. There is a limit to the madness, but it's more generous than you'd think. I was out here spamming! I believe the intention was to speed up the early stages of combat, but things get way too out of hand when combined with Overdrive. At the negligible cost of 3000 TP, Overdrive is notorious for being the most broken mechanic in Xenoblade history, and for better or worse, Monolith Soft embraced that. Not only does Quick Recast make it easier to break, but the initial time limit has increased from 15 seconds to 25! Overdrive will surge your power, defense, and cooldown speed based on how high its counter is. Increasing this counter is performed by using the same color of arts or by juggling specific patterns. The time limit can be extended if you're able to gain another 3000 TP, and that's where many players will struggle, including myself. I didn't bother to properly master Overdrive until this very playthrough, but little did I know, in Definitive Edition, there is nothing to master. All you need is a reasonable lineup of arts and you'll virtually become invincible. And this is where I feel a huge divide between myself and the Xenoblade X community. My favorite combat in the franchise is Xenoblade 2's. Its combos are rewarding to get good at, but it's not like the game is solved as soon as you learn them. There's plenty of other complementary systems that are gratifying to put together. In Xenoblade X, I don't even know what half of the vocabulary means. And I broke the game by just being decent at Overdrive. It is beloved for being exhilarating, and it sure as hell is, but at some point I realized I'm just staring at my arts, making sure I'm spamming them in the same pattern with no consideration for anything else that's happening aside from accidentally pressing the B button unless the game tells me to. And while that is enjoyable on its own, it's hard for me to get invested in the battle when, I'm not looking at the battle. Not that I'd want to with how blurry it gets. It wouldn't be an issue if it wasn't instantly broken. There is no build-up at all. It doesn't feel earned whatsoever. I went from not being good at Overdrive to getting an infinite as soon as I unlocked it. Call me a wet blanket, but I wouldn't want it to ever return without a hefty nerf. Because Overdrive isn't just over-centralizing, it is selfish. In most cases, it doesn't matter what the enemy is doing. It doesn't matter what your party members are doing. Literally nothing else matters when the funny numbers appear. But hey, if you disagree, I get it. Who needs Xenoblade Warriors when we have Overdrive? It certainly achieves the power fantasy that's somewhat missing in Skell combats. It's cool to look at, but once the novelty fades, it's pretty much a slower, more basic version of the normal battle system. Granted, they are indeed powerful, so I mainly use Skells to level grind. They can easily cheese opponents that are higher leveled. In fact, most enemies will die quickly to a full party of Skells, and the few that don't will die to a grounded Overdrive anyway. Now, regardless of your opinion on the changes in combats, it's hard to deny that in totality, this is one of the best remasters ever made. It lives up to its name as being definitive. The UI is vastly improved, especially with how pitiful the original text size was. The tutorials aren't ideal, but they're unmistakably better than before. The quest tracking has become typical of the franchise at this point, yet it is the most welcome in an open world. And even though leveling up still takes a while, there is overall a major cutback on grinding. Now, it is worth acknowledging that as fruitful as these quality of life features are, they do tend to expose how cumbersome the Wii U version was. I mean, being able to change party members in a menu is not something worth praising. It should just be common sense. What did take me by surprise is how it nearly removed field skills. These skills were originally acquired by prioritizing the role of the player's chosen division. In the remaster, the vast majority of field actions do not require a field skill. Thus, divisions are only useful for extra materials, which makes that 10-minute cutscene all the more hilarious. Adding a mechanic is one thing. I did not expect two of them to be outright neutered. It goes to show how Monolith Soft wanted to do everything they could to streamline Xenoblade X. They were fully aware it is a process to get into. Most of all though, I was continually impressed with the enhancements in visuals. While the pop-in is pretty bad and the frame rate drops in busy areas, the trade-off was more than worth it. This is the sharpest Xenoblade game by a landslide, both docked and on handheld. To accomplish this on the Switch 1 is nothing short of remarkable. You would not be able to tell that this was a Wii U game by just looking at it. But alas, there are some persisting hiccups that do show its age. I can't believe they didn't fix the audio balance. It is horrendous. Each dialogue choice pauses the cutscene instead of playing it out naturally. And if you did miss something, too bad. There's no way to rewatch cutscenes. It was previously misreported that the cars in New LA were solid, and honestly, I'm glad they're not. Headgear can only be turned off for everyone, not individually. I don't know why it doesn't work like the rest of the body. The AI is probably the worst in the franchise. They barely attempt to revive you, and they almost never leave the Skell when told. The enemies insist on fighting through walls, which is a pain in the ass in dense environments. You can't battle while swimming, like in Xenoblade 3, so your overdrive can end by just dipping a toe in water. And those last two grievances are exactly why caves suck. They are so confined and occasionally full of water. However, if there is any disappointment to have with this remaster, it has to be involving the music. One of the most highly demanded updates was to add a toggle for the flying theme. As nice as it is, it's unfortunate that the overworld theme is interrupted even when flying a measly distance. At least you get to hear them. Once you start learning Overdrive, say goodbye to most of the other battle themes. And so instead of adding a toggle for either of those situations, Monolith Soft decided to add more interruptions. The music now resets after battle. It doesn't pick up where it left off, so get used to memorizing the beginning of each theme. I'll give the benefit of the doubt that these are oversights and will likely be patched, but what's too late to alter is the soundtrack itself. Xenoblade 1 received a portfolio of arrangements, while X received less than a handful. And while it is cool that Hiroyuki Sawano returns for the few new tracks, I do have to admit they are a tad underwhelming. Now that I think about it, there's no better representation of Xenoblade X than its soundtrack. It's had as much of a comeback as the game itself. Not only was it controversial for being about the opposite of Xenoblade 1, but Sawano was already polarizing himself. Though he may be an anime industry legend, Xenoblade X is far from the first time he was criticized. But let's face it, history could not have been kinder. The Xenoblade community has only accumulated more and more anime fans who already enjoy or at least are open to his bombastic style of music. The haters on Wii U mostly just moved on with their lives, while the rest of us were Stockholm syndromed by Black Tar and New LA. Not to mention, there has been a major recent shift in embracing vocal themes in gaming. Think of how iconic modern Sonic, Persona, and Nier music are. X's soundtrack is the embodiment of this entire game's redemption. It was created in the wrong place, at the wrong time, but it could not be more revered today. You may think I've been awfully negative in this video, but that's only because the good things about Xenoblade X are blatantly obvious, while the questionable parts tend to be swept under the rug. Whether it's the die-hard Wii U elitists or the new Switch players who are just happy to be here, I understand the desperation for this long-since overshadowed game to finally get its spotlight, but that doesn't mean we have to sugarcoat it. Well, actually, the story is good because it exists. That's more than you can say about most open world games, right? That's totally true, right? Right? And sure, the eat Tatsu joke was annoying at first, but once I heard it for the 69th time, then it started to get funny. And that's how you know a running gag works. Guys, come on. The bar is on the floor when you say things like that. Look, I can't blame anyone for preferring X to the mainline trilogy, but personally speaking, Definitive Edition cemented the opposite. Because the greatest irony of Xenoblade X is that every reason we love it is a backhanded compliment. We as fans have always claimed that X is a gameplay-driven experience when what we actually mean is that the main campaign is boring. We sugarcoat how terrible the pacing is because the terrific gameplay is more than worth the wait. We insist the soundtrack is incredible and wave off anyone who doesn't agree, even though our favorite memes wouldn't exist if the quality was consistent. We applaud Overdrive for how broken we can make it, yet it is so innately broken, it proves just how meaningless a bulk of the mechanics are. And we celebrate Definitive Edition for all of its major improvements, despite the fact that we gaslit everyone for a decade about X being divisive only because it wasn't focused on the story. In reality, the original Wii U version was the most flawed Xenoblade game, and even now with this remaster, it can still feel clunky at times from a fundamentally uneven design. But no video game, no work of art is as simple as a list of pros and cons. At the end of the day, we love video games because we love to be immersed. and you'd be hard-pressed to find a more rewarding open world to immerse in than the world of Xenoblade X. Because at its peak, its gameplay is peak. There is nothing that compares to running or flying around Mira and unraveling the twisted nature of its glamour. There may be some hurdles and speed bumps along the way, but that won't prevent many of us from gladly leaping forward and taking no fall damage. This is a great entry point to any newcomer to the franchise, and even if you don't care about the mainline games, its fascinating world is still worth considering. But if you are a veteran, like myself, then you'll be glad to know that the new story content is worth its own rant. We are about to dive into full spoiler mode for Xenoblade X as well as the other titles for the sake of comparison. So if you need to head out now, thank you so much for watching, and I wish you a happy journey on Mira. Maybe it's about time we started using its Japanese title, Xenoblade Cross. Let's get my biggest criticism out of the way. The new map, Volataris, doesn't feature the same exploration as Mira's continents. Instead, we're trying to locate our many party members and 6 spears to weaken the final boss. While it sounds cool on paper, it eventually became obnoxious with how dense the area is. It is littered with enemies. As I alluded to earlier, some of the fights are clearly designed for high-level Skells, so if you're someone like me who came in overconfident, it is absolutely miserable at times. Otherwise, Chapter 13 is fantastic. I wouldn't put it on the same level as Torna or Future Redeemed, but compared to the main campaign, it is a substantial improvement. They crammed a ton of plot into this, which might be seen as a negative, but I think it was necessary to compensate for the base game. Lyn and especially Elma gained so much depth here, and I was infatuated with the new party member, Al. Al is like a more Dilfy version of Adam, and well, I loved Adam, and I love Al as much as we love pizza. He gets me blowing hard in December. Oh god. I teared up at the mere possibility of his death. Hell, I even got emotional at Omomo. That's a big difference from the main campaign, where it was hard for me to feel anything. Now of course, by default, I am thrilled at the prospect of X being connected to the mainline trilogy, but how they got there, I found to be really clever. Despite all their differences, every Xenoblade game shares one important theme in their world building. Mind over body, the idea that one's personality and memories is what makes them who they are. That has escalated further and further into the series. For it to be the common ground that ties everything together is so poetic. Currently though, the general sentiment online seems to be divisive. It's way too early to say that reflects the whole community. Most people won't even beat the game until another few weeks. And if you are one of the few who have seen the ending, odds are you're a Xenoblade lore addict or a devoted X fan who swears the original story was good. Either way, out of anyone, you are the most likely to be picky in this situation. Still, I do feel bad for those X fans in particular. You were led to believe that Lao was alive and Mira was the mystery. I get the frustration of having to wait 10 years just to find out they were both red herrings. I also empathize with being skeptical of the multiverse. That is among my least favorite tropes. But to immediately dismiss it would be foolishly close-minded. That's like when I see someone complain about the tropes in Xenoblade 2. 9 times out of 10, they don't understand the story as well as they think they do. And that's because they're so stuck on it being a trope that they're ironically preventing themselves from seeing the depth they're asking for. Considering that Xenoblade has already had Kloss creating multiple worlds and the conduit transcending multiple dimensions, I don't think we have to be pessimistic about multiple universes. But that's just one side of it. If anything, I knew this chapter would be divisive based on Mira's destruction alone. Now, in the long run, I do think it's for the best. This was an impactful means of antagonizing the ghosts. Let's be honest, we don't give a damn about the ghosts destroying Earth. We as players have no attachment to that. So if your feelings are hurt about Mira, then good, that was the point. There's an entire act dedicated to those feelings, and now you actually feel the weight of these major antagonists. Some will argue that it undercuts the base game, like everything they did was for nothing. But like it or not, it was never about Mira itself. It was about humanity learning to cope with losing Earth, to coexist with other Xenos, and to rectify their mistakes from Project Exodus. And so what this chapter does is not only show how much they've grown from that experience, but it allows them to carry a large part of it into the future. Remember, all of those species we know and love are being brought forward. It's not like their lore was abandoned. The loss of their universe and the mere fear of the ghosts are going to provide much more tension and conflict to their narratives. And above all else, regardless of what happens, Monolith Soft had the balls to do something that most developers wouldn't have. They made the player feel the same grief as an entire civilization. I respect any storyteller that is bold enough to take that risk. I would take that any day over people whining about reusing the same open world or an abrupt cliffhanger to an unpromising story. As much as I criticize Xenoblade X Definitive Edition, it left me with the most important feeling of all: hope. I firmly believe that the next Xenoblade will take the best of the trilogy and X and put them together, much like 3 was a marriage of 1 and 2. We can argue about how we got here, but I think we can agree that combining the gameplay of X and the writing of the trilogy is going to be a future that is out of this world.